April 2019. You just got out of the theater watching Avengers Endgame. A 3-hour epic with dozens of named superheroes, nearly all of which appear on screen at the same time. A movie that dominated pop culture discourse for months after its release, and quickly became the highest grossing film ever at the time. A movie packed with so many unbelievable moments that you probably don't even remember the scene where the Hulk dabs. A movie that, while not without its flaws, is generally seen as a pretty incredible conclusion to a 22-movie saga. If you had any questions coming out of this movie, one of them was probably, where can Marvel possibly go from here? If you've been keeping up with the latest MCU content, you might think the answer would always be nowhere, or at least nowhere good. It's not exactly a hot take to call Phase 4 an incoherent mess of largely mediocre content. But honestly, it didn't have to be this way. Obviously, we'd feel a lot different about Phase 4 if these movies and shows were all good, but that's much easier said than done. Plus, it's not like the MCU has ever had a perfect track record. Phase 1 arguably had more mid-movies than good ones, but we were okay with it because it felt like the franchise was building momentum and would eventually improve, which it did. That's not the feeling I get with Phase 4, but it easily could have been. Like I hinted at earlier, Endgame might have been the single biggest event in the history of blockbuster cinema. It definitely wasn't the best movie ever made, but in its own way, it almost felt like it was. No movie demanded your attention, both on and off screen, in quite the same way. It was so grandiose and monumental that any kind of follow-up would inevitably stand in its shadow. After Endgame, the safest option for Marvel Studios would be to revert to the feel of Phase 1. Dial back the stakes, release just a few products each year, and focus on standalone, smaller-scale stories, either about the aftermath of Endgame or introductions to new characters. There was just no way they could keep expanding the scope of the franchise at the same rate without it feeling desperate and contrived. And then, Kevin Feige said, "Hold my beer." 6 movies and 7 shows. That's well over 40 hours of content, all within the last year and a half. That's way more than they've ever released before Endgame, when they stuck to just 2 or 3 movies a year. Sure, they didn't release anything in 2020, but that was when the onset of the pandemic was shaking up everyone's lives. And the absolutely packed 2021 schedule made that previous year feel like hitting the pause button in an action-packed scene, rather than actively attempting to slow the pace of the series. And sure, some of these new shows do partially fit the description of small-scale epilogue/origin story. WandaVision is a very personal story about nostalgia and loss, and Ms. Marvel is a pretty lighthearted and fun introduction to a new hero. But it's also a show about extra-dimensional aliens plotting to take over the world, in a year featuring tons of other extra-dimensional villains, not to mention an ancient cosmic titan emerging from the Earth and a maniac trying to murder all the gods. The dial-back ship has long since sailed. So Marvel wants to keep escalating. Okay. That's an uphill battle, but it's not impossible. The real problem is that Marvel has stuck with all the burdens of an enormous franchise with almost none of the benefits. See, expanding your already massive universe has pros and cons, probably too many to name, but I'll try to list the big ones here. The advantages are feeling epic, expanding creative horizons, and continuing to develop characters and settings over multiple films. The disadvantages are demanding a lot from your audience, holding on to a potentially stale formula, and losing quality control. Now, if you're clever, you can try to maximize the benefits while minimizing the downsides, but Marvel seems to be doing the opposite. We'll start with the first potential benefit, feeling epic. Nothing in Phase 4 has had anywhere near the weight of Endgame. Shocking, I know. Not only has the franchise felt pretty aimless, with no real recurring villains or conflicts, but the sheer volume of them makes it impossible to see these movies as big, important events. As Captain Midnight puts it, how can I miss you if you never go away? Let's move on to the next benefit, the opportunity to expand creative horizons. With this many characters in a universe this wide, it should be the perfect opportunity to ditch the standard Marvel formula we're all getting tired of at this point. And well, Phase 4 tries, but not really enough. And for whatever reason, it seems to have gotten less creative over time. WandaVision is genuinely experimental for all but the last 2 episodes. It really annoys me how removing the show's pointless villain would have made the ending so much better. But otherwise, the show is really inventive. Then you've got Loki, which has a trippy Doctor Who/Twilight Zone feel and much less action than your typical Marvel experience. But more recently, we've got things like Multiverse of Madness, where Sam Raimi's struggle to make a weird horror movie within the Marvel template is incredibly obvious. And Miss Marvel, where the end-of-the-world plot doesn't mesh with the teen dramedy aspects at all. Also, that show's first episode had some really creative visuals that the showrunners just left in the dust. Like, look at this. It's like the Scott Pilgrim sequel we never got. But nah, this was too cool. We barely see anything like it past the first episode. Probably the most egregious case of missed potential was Thor: Love and Thunder, a movie so dismissive of its own story and so desperate to make us laugh that it gaslit half the internet into thinking Taika Waititi never understood these characters and was never funny in the first place. This movie is the cinematic equivalent of ordering at a restaurant only for the waiter to piss on your dinner plate, do a Fortnite dance, and shout, "It's just a prank, bro," over and over again. Sure, you might laugh at the sheer inanity, but you never want to revisit the experience. And you walk away thinking about how a potentially excellent meal was completely ruined. This movie could have been even better than Ragnarok if Taika and Disney actually committed to anything other than shallow digs at everything we're supposed to care about. That's not to say the movie can't be funny, it probably should be, but the jokes should also have novelty and purpose. Do something other than stretching the standard Marvel comedy playbook to a nauseating extreme. Off the top of my head, why not make it a rom-com? That's what I assumed it would be based on the title, and there actually is a cute rom-com montage early on, which, surprise surprise, is one of the only good scenes in the movie. Other than that, Love and Thunder is basically allergic to romance. Natalie Portman is absolutely wasted, although I can't say for certain she would have ever worked because once again, she looks like she does not want to be in the movie. But maybe that's because your character is even more hollow than she was in the first 2 Thor movies. Okay, I guess that brings me to the last potential upside of a huge franchise. The chance to develop characters and settings over multiple installments. Not only is Marvel not really doing this, they're taking it a step backward by actively contradicting themselves. Character arcs are reversed or just plain forgotten about in future installments. Thor learns to think for himself and care more about people than weapons, but now he's a bumbling idiot who can't empathize with anyone. Wanda learns to let go of her comfortable life and realize the harm she caused in Westview, but now she's on a murderous rampage to steal children from another dimension. I know she was influenced by the Darkhold, but that feels incredibly cheap when her previous motivations felt so compelling and human. Loki does have a pretty decent arc in his show, but it's an alternate version of the character, so it isn't set up by previous movies at all. The lack of real continuity means there's no reason to care about character development going forward. The same goes for the world building. Apparently, there's a cosmic being who can just grant people's wishes, who all the Asgardians know about. That would have been useful when trying to reverse Thanos' snap. Loki tells us that the TVA consolidated the multiverse into one timeline, but we've seen people go to other dimensions at least as far back as the first Doctor Strange. And yeah, maybe there's a difference between other dimensions and other timelines, but we never learn what it is, and the result is just a confused audience. Well, this is as good a time as any to get into the negatives of a massively expanding universe, and how Marvel is doing a terrible job keeping them in check. First of all, it's demanding a lot from its audience. We're getting a new movie or show approximately once a month, and while they don't all tie into one another, they do draw from previous content, and it's expected that they'll lay the groundwork for future installments. You probably won't fully understand Captain America 4 without having seen Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and the same goes for Echo and the Hawkeye show. Some of these recent shows might be total dead ends, but there's no way for us to know as an audience. We need to keep watching or risk getting left in the dust. As Captain Midnight again put it in an excellent video I recommend you watch, this was acceptable when the MCU was just 3 movies a year, but now that we also have dozens of hours of TV, it'll be much harder to convince people to keep watching. The next pitfall is holding on to a stale formula. One of the benefits I mentioned earlier was the opportunity to experiment with new styles, and this is the other side of that coin. A new installment in a massive franchise needs to strike a balance between feeling unique and justifying its existence, while also feeling cohesive with the rest of its universe. And Marvel can't seem to decide what that balance should be. I mentioned earlier that WandaVision, Ms. Marvel, and Doctor Strange 2 have premises that feel actively constrained by the Marvel formula. And I think letting individual creators be more adventurous could help bring the MCU out of the slump it's currently in. And that brings me to my last point. As a franchise grows larger and larger, quality control becomes harder and harder. And I think most would agree that for Marvel, it's starting to slip. Phase 4 has definitely given us some good things. And it's not like the earlier phases were perfect. But I think the average product used to be much better. Just look back at what we were getting in 2017 and 2018. Guardians 2, Homecoming, Ragnarok, Black Panther, Infinity War. All 5 of these movies are top tier MCU in my book. And I don't think anything in Phase 4 except maybe WandaVision can measure up to any of them. It's possible that this is just coincidence, but I think it's more likely that Marvel needs to be much more careful with what to greenlight and what to put out. They should take a step back and realize exactly what they're doing with their franchise. Examine those strengths and weaknesses of trying to expand the MCU from enormously popular film franchise to unmoving center of all entertainment. They should try everything they can to maximize those benefits while minimizing those flaws. One look at the world of online film criticism will tell you that a growing number of people, me included, are losing patience with the franchise. Our takes might not amount to much, especially to the Disney execs who only see the MCU as a money machine. But I think they're increasingly catching on in the fanbase at large. Sure, the latest MCU movies have done quite well at the box office, but that momentum isn't gonna last forever. Thor: Love and Thunder had one of the biggest second-week drop-offs in the history of the franchise, and I don't know how many people are really excited for something like Ant-Man 3 or the Marvels. The MCU has asked more and more of its audience while providing less and less, and I don't see the franchise continuing at the current rate for much longer. Maybe it can learn to balance its massive weight and go back to consistently making good to great content, but I wouldn't count on it, nor am I really rooting for it. Because at the end of the day, even if the MCU completely collapses, this kind of big franchise filmmaking isn't going anywhere. It'll just be picked up by someone else. A studio who can make movies without the massive burden of having to fit into a 100-hour franchise. At least, not yet.